Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are jumping back into King in Black Symbiote Spider-Man, and in this case getting into part 3 and part 4, which at this point brings in Monica Rambeau, who clearly has like the perfect power set for like an event like this, given the circumstance that she knows what she's up against. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get your spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping back in part 3, it comes in around the time when Peter's heading to the Avengers Mansion after hearing from Ned that Mr. E will be going for the Black Knight, with Ned being one of Mr. E's shadow creatures for a moment, which allowed Ned to see some of Mr. E's intentions. But even with Peter rushing back, like he wasn't there in time to help Dane, and as a result, Mr. E took the ebony blade and stabbed the Black Knight with his own sword. And on top of that, before Peter could reach, Dane was also found by Kang and Rocket Raccoon, who had then taken him shortly after to tend to his wounds. But in the case of Peter, who's making his way over there like as fast as he can swing, and when he gets there, like he doesn't go straight for the Black Knight because he believes that he's down there along with Merlin and at this time that Mr. E's on the way. So when Peter gets there and he sees like one of the new Quinjets, which Tony's designed that can go faster than the speed of light, Peter then tries to get the jet's attention because he believes that either Tony or some other Avengers are on it, so he jumps on it to kind of wave them down and tell them who's on their way so he can get their help. But when Peter jumps on the prototype Quinjet, he looks inside and it's none other than Mr. E, stealing another jet. Or I guess last time it was technically a space shuttle. But either way, like this guy's got a pattern, man. And like out of all the information which he's taken from other hosts, like Lewis Tuttle, the NASA scientist, like Mr. E, he has used some of it for engineering, but even in that case, like he still uses all that engineering and that knowledge for boosting rocket ships. And every time he has a plan, he's gonna need a rocket. But when he sees Peter and more or less gets him off by putting up the Quinjet shields, Peter is then caught by Kang in Rocket's ship. And from there, when Peter more or less comes to and figures out what happened, with much gratitude, he looks at Kang and then kicks the mess out of him. And really, this is one of those things to where like you have a villain who's trying to do good, and in every case that another hero comes along, they have got to explain themselves, and with doing so, usually the fighting comes first. And even in this case, like it doesn't help that his name is Kang the Conqueror, because apparently with that name, you gonna catch the paws on sight. But even with this, like also in this case, Peter has a bit of suspicion that Kang is involved somehow with Mr. E. And it isn't really until this fight is fizzled down and Rocket also steps in to where Peter finds out that Kang is actually telling the truth and that he's really here to help. And at this point, Kang and Rocket, they show Spider-Man that they've taken in the Black Knight, as well as a few others who at one point had became Mr. E's shadow slaves. And Kang more or less makes sense out of the idea that he would want to save the universe, which is why he came here in the first place, and is also why he's helping to heal the Black Knight. But also with Kang explaining more of the details of the situation to Spider-Man, Kang also tells him that he knows these guys. And Peter mentions that they've often told him that him and Mr. E are the Spider Slaves, that they're in some way related, but Peter doesn't fully understand. And from there, Kang kind of drops the conversation, and he tells Peter that he'll find out in due time. But right after that, when Kang starts talking to the shadow creature, which he has contained, the creature starts giving all these threats on how it's gonna kill everybody here, and Kang more or less is like, yeah, that's interesting, but I pretty much got all these containers set up to extract every shadow creature from its host to where it can then just spit them out into a nearby passing sun. Which is precisely what Kang does when he expels this shadow creature, and he gives them the old-fashioned Captain Universe treatment. But as soon as this happens, we then see the host who was previously taken over by the shadow creature, who at this time is Captain Marvel, Monica Rambeau. And when Spider-Man sees her and is like, hey, that's Captain Marvel, Rocket's kind of like, nah, Captain Marvel's a Kree guy. But Spider-Man's like, nope, not anymore. But then it's here like when Monica wakes up and she recognizes Spider-Man, but then when she sees Kang, it's like it's on and popping again. And she's able to quickly get out of her containment by going infrared, but then when she goes after Kang, he quickly puts his shields up and Monica just bounces right off. But this time the fight isn't as long because Rocket jumps in sooner, and the attention is then taken towards the talking raccoon, who's named after a Beatles song. But not long after this, Kang and Rocket, they fill in Monica and Peter, letting them know that Mr. E has taken the ebony blade, and Monica also shares what she learned from the shadow creature when she was taken, which is how they come to the conclusion that Mr. E wants to destroy it. So then now to find Mr. E, they now have to find out how to destroy it, because knowing this will lead them right to him. And at first, Peter's like, we'll just throw it into the sun. But then the Black Knight wakes up and he tells him that throwing it into the sun like that just won't work. And the reason why is because when Merlin had forged the ebony blade from the Starstone, Merlin had to use heat and magic to craft it. And for that reason, like, just throwing it into the sun won't work. Like, heroes swear that's the answer to everything, just throw it in the sun. But after discussing the creation of the ebony blade, Monica then tells them that there's no question like where Mr. E is trying to take it, which as it turns out would have to be nowhere, which is the severed head of a celestial, thanks to Knull, which later got converted into a supermarket, or better yet more of a flea market. Not to mention that this is also where Knull had created the Necro Sword. But it also makes sense for Mr. E to bring it here because this is also a place where rare weapons are made. And because of that, it's not too off of an idea that you would find someone here who forges and uses magic to create powerful weapons for a bargain. And this is exactly the type of person who Mr. E would need to find to have the skills to destroy the ebony blade. And in this case, it turns out to be a troll by the name of Ulissa, and I kind of like the way that this is done because she's a troll in Troll's craft using magic, but also this isn't like your case to where you're looking for this rare person and they're somewhere up on a mountaintop thinking about knowledge. And it's like when you think about it with a bit of a realistic perspective, usually people with that kind of value, they're not just sitting around doing nothing. And this is what I like about the inclusion of Ulissa, because with her being needed and Mr. E finding her here, she's out here like, yo, I'm trying to get this paper. Or better yet, credits in this case. But then on top of Mr. E arriving here and soliciting Ulissa's services, they are then met by the arrival of her brother, Ulick, who at this time Ulissa had been hiding from, and mainly because of the whole troll custom of killing their siblings. But recently Ulick had got a tip that he should come and get the ebony blade here, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But with Ulick crashing the party, so to speak, which then gives Mr. E the opportunity to just go in with the combo. And with doing so, like, Mr. E, he nearly finishes Ulick like super quick, but he's then stopped by Ulissa, who more or less tells him like she doesn't want to kill her brother, but if anybody does kill her brother, then it's gonna be her. Which once again takes us back to the whole troll custom thing. Which is weird, but at the same time, it's like their survival of the fittest solution, more or less. But at this point, their confrontation's then broken up by the head of security, Cosmo the Space Dog. And with this happening, like, it then gives Ulick the chance to try to go after Mr. E again. But because the first time Ulick didn't get a swing in, he also didn't realize, like, this dude is intangible, with very few exceptions. And I'm not gonna front, like, if Mr. E had only held the ebony blade behind his back in this moment, like, this could have been a brutality. Missed opportunity, Mr. E. Missed opportunity. But also when this happens, Spider-Man and the others arrive, and when Peter gets there, he hits Mr. E with the Obi-Wan Kenobi Star Wars quote, which at this point in time wouldn't be a really old movie, but rather something that was recent in theaters. Ah man, theaters. Y'all remember those? Man, like, hopefully we get them back by next Christmas, because as of right now, that's the only place that Spider-Man No Way Home is premiering. So fingers crossed that everything just falls into place. But in the case of Spider-Man going up against Mr. E, both Rocket and Kang, they then make their way in, but Rocket's blast, they just go through Mr. E, nearly hitting Spider-Man, and then on top of that, Mr. E also uses the ebony blade to absorb the energy from some of the blasts and send it right back at Rocket and Kang. So at this point, Mr. E, like, he's adapting to all their attacks pretty well, because he's also figured out how to make himself intangible to Spider-Man and his symbiote again. But then this is also where Monica Rambeau steps in. Because when she arrives, like, she's now figured out to this point that if she fills Mr. E with ultraviolet light, that this would then solidify him and keep him still so the others can attack. And it's pretty clever because Monica, she's essentially using one of Mr. E's tactics on himself, because the same way Mr. E would take a host and take their knowledge and combine it with what he knows to get what he wants, Monica has essentially done the same thing. Because for her, after being bonded with the shadow creature, she's then learned their weaknesses, and because of that, she knows what type of light to transform into now in order to stop him in his tracks. And for Monica, it's not like she always has to see a light or absorb it in order to duplicate it, but it's like if she needs to, she can, but if she just knows that a specific type of light is what she needs, she can either produce it or just become it, as long as she's been aware to that spectrum prior to this point. And in this moment, it comes in really clutch, because without her, like, they would have been in trouble. But with her holding Mr. E still, Spider-Man then gets in a punch, which wasn't necessary, but then Rocket shoots the ebony blade out of his hand, and Kang uses his separation algorithm to send Mr. E back into a containment back on Rocket's ship, which as a result then frees Smythe and they take him aboard shortly after. And so from here, they gotta kind of come to a solution as far as where to take Mr. E or what to do with him. And as a result, they then take him to the Collector, which is a more reasonable solution since we know that the Captain Universe throw him into the sun thing was a no-go. But the funny thing is, like, not long after they bring Mr. E to the Collector, Peter's then like, wait a minute, like, who got the sword? Because apparently everybody was just so excited about getting Mr. E and taking him in, and I guess figuring out where they were gonna take him, that nobody really thought to pick up the ebony blade along the way. And it's here where we jump back to nowhere that we find out that Ulick, he had actually been sent here by someone to retrieve the ebony blade, which is how he had popped up here in the first place. And when Peter, Kang, and the others go back to nowhere to pick up the ebony blade, they come to find that Ulick is still there. And mainly because he was still trying to kill Ulyssa, because he just couldn't grab the sword and go. And it's like he was the perfect and the worst person to send to do this job. Like, he was both at the same time. But with Peter and the others going back for the sword, they of course get into it with Ulick, and then security gets involved again, which brings back Cosmo, which at this point, like, it even has Peter thinking like, this is all ridiculous. Like, talking raccoons and dogs, like, what are we doing here? But it's here where things calm down a little bit that we find out that Ulick didn't know that his sister was here. And in addition, we also find out like who sent Ulick in the first place, who as it turns out was Uatu the Watcher, which then kind of begs the question, like, if Uatu knew that Ulyssa was here, like, he had to have known of how like Ulick was going to respond to that, because he's the Watcher. Like, how could he not know? But when Uatu arrives here, like, he doesn't even get into all that, but instead he lets him know like why he had sent Ulick to get the sword, and it's here where he tells him that the ebony blade is needed to destroy Knull. And I'm excited to see exactly how that's going to play out, with issue 5 being the conclusion to King in Black Symbiote Spider-Man, which will be like your finale slash face-off between Symbiote Spider-Man and Knull. Cause like with the way that Symbiote Spider-Man is throwing in like all these older stories, they're essentially just memories that the symbiote has hidden away from Peter and Eddie, of which we're recently getting more information on. And I'm here for it, but with seeing it, I also hope that some of this stuff comes back in like the present day, or even at some point in the future as well. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/Dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below or over on Discord, either way. And we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.